Our first speaker today will start this process. Jens Dahl holds the equivalent of a PhD in anthropology from the University of Copenhagen. He received this in 1974. His scientific and practical experience regarding indigenous peoples worldwide covers field research and indigenous communities in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Pacific, Russia, and the Arctic. Moreover, he has for decades participated regularly in UN meetings on indigenous issues, including the working group that prepared the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the group that prepared the establishment of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. You can read about these experiences in his 2012 book, The Indigenous Space and Marginalized People in the United Nations, published by Paul Grave Macmillan. And there were, at least by my count, 10 books with his name on the cover besides that, and these are the ones in English. Jens Dahl is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Copenhagen, and his presentation today is entitled How the Subaltern Took Agency at the United Nations. After his talk, responses will be given by Bruce Mannheim, professor of anthropology here at U of M, and Tsutsui, associate professor of sociology and director of the Human Rights Initiative. Please welcome Jens Dahl.
First of all, thank you, Scott Lyons and Kelly Askew, for inviting me to this meeting today. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope the next half an hour or so to be able to introduce you to a unique universe, which the indigenous peoples in the United Nations really is. My background, as Scott said, was that I have participated in these meetings for quite a number of years as a participant, as an activist. I'm not an indigenous person myself. And having taken part in so many of these meetings, I one day thought, I would like to one day have the opportunity to sit just at a side bench and see what is really going on in this room. I mean, one thing is that you are participating every day, you are doing a lot of work, but as a researcher, as I've done so much research over the years, what is really going on in this world? So I left the organization International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs in 2006 and joined a rather big research project that we call Alternative Spaces, and my job was there to look at indigenous peoples in the UN. And I did that, and as Scott said, I finished writing a book on it a year and a half ago. The story about indigenous peoples in the United Nations is a story about how ethnic groups or nations from all parts of the world have been able to overcome cultural differences and cracking the codes which are similar to all of them but expressed in ways very specific to each group. It has been a process of cultural learning, understanding, and acceptance, resulting in the construction of common interest, common symbols, creation and recreation of identities, and finally making common platform for agency. I guess that's seen as a process of cultural understanding. The indigenous UN process has been unique, and it's naturally then to ask what we as researchers or engaged observers can learn from it. And I agree completely with Scott that in many ways this is a positive experience, and we always look into problems, but we should also, what can we learn from the good issues? First, some more historical remark. By the way, now that Tom mentioned this very early, indigenous peoples in the UN, there is a short movie called Indian Summer in Geneva, which I can highly recommend for you who know very little about it. It's a beautiful small video or movement. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. Otherwise, it's easy to see where you can find. I can only recommend that one. In September 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This landmark decision followed more than 20 years of negotiations between governments and indigenous peoples. I have the words of government diplomats, each having decades of experience on negotiating human rights in the United Nations, that this was the most difficult process that they had ever been involved in. This long process tells about how indigenous peoples, who have used 25 years to educate government representatives and observers, simultaneously have been able continuously to challenge the authority or monopoly of states or researchers to determine and control what it means to be indigenous. Instead, indigenous peoples have taken control of the right to identify themselves because, as they often say, we know who we are. In this process that was formed by indigenous peoples themselves, the notion of indigenous peoples has also changed. Being indigenous peoples in 2014 is very different from being indigenous in 1982. And just to give you one example, that was when the negotiations on the establishment of a permanent forum on indigenous issues took place. There came up the issue, well, how big should this permanent forum be? And indigenous people said, oh, at least 25 or 50, each government and each indigenous peoples. And the government said, no, 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 there are only 5 regions in the world, so it can only be 10 persons. And discussions went on, and the Latin Americans said, but we are so many indigenous communities in Latin America, and the Africans said exactly the same. And the government said, but you are not going to represent your community. You're going to be indigenous experts, and you're representing all indigenous peoples. And that discussion came up very heated, because then, okay, there was only one elected from Latin America, and the person elected wanted to represent, but I only want to represent my community. And the other said, no, 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 you're representing all indigenous peoples. And this notion, I mean, people had been there for 20 years, and now they were suddenly not only Kuna Indians from Panama, no, they were primarily indigenous. And this is a completely different way of thinking. They had, I mean, they had become indigenous, but how to do it what does that mean in reality? So it was very different during those years. In accordance with the practice adopted by the United Nations, I take a relational or constructivist approach to the identification of indigenousness, rather than a static or positivist approach as favored by those who insist on a definition on what it means to be indigenous. Indigenousness is an evolving concept, and in the United Nations, people identify themselves as indigenous in their interaction with each other and with governments. In the United Nations, indigenous peoples organized a process that created unity among themselves vis-a-vis states. But at the same time, it was also a social transformation of their own internal understanding of who they were and of their identity. However, the process also reflected what took place outside the corridors of the United Nations. In very simple terms, there was an Inuit woman, Rhoda Inukshuk, who took part in such negotiations, and she once said, we came to Ottawa as Eskimos, but we left as Inuit. Although the term Inuit can be understood as a kind of product of colonialism, because it more or less is the same as Eskimo with an Inuit verb, Inuit name, it is still more than that, because it indicates a wish to turn alterity into self-determined development. In a similar way, the historian Henry Minde described how the Sami resistance to the Alta hydroelectric scheme in Norway turned an environmental issue into a question of Sami rights, and then ending up as an indigenous people's issue. Likewise, in the United Nations, indigenous people have turned a process of exclusion into a process of inclusion, by transforming symbols of authenticity into symbols of otherness, and then to symbols of common identity. People come to the United Nations as pastoralists, hunters, gatherers, fishermen, farmers, academics, and so on, and they came from backgrounds where they belong to scheduled tribes, minorities, indigenous communities, Aboriginals or Métis, and so on, but they leave the United Nations as indigenous, being part of a global indigenous space and a global indigenous movement. While government and others were occupied with a definitional issue, indigenous peoples themselves created a global movement, united by a claimed global indigenous identity. By organizing themselves, indigenous peoples have forced governments and researchers to take their own notion of indigenous as serious. It has not been easy, and it is still controversial. Most difficult for observers is to accept that indigenousness is a strategic and dynamic process which reflects power relations between indigenous peoples and states on one hand, and on the other hand, indigenousness also reflects the scope and level of indigenous unity. When indigenous peoples for the first time in 1977 in a collective effort knocked on the doors of the United Nations, and that's what this movement I mentioned earlier on is about. They came primarily from the Americas, but were soon joined by other groups from Arctic Hawaii, Australia, and New Zealand. In the United Nations, they called themselves very quickly with a common name, Indigenous Peoples. At home, however, these people saw themselves as, first of all, Sami, Haudenosaunee, Maori, and so on. But in the United Nations, they met people from other parts of the world with the same experience and with the same frustrations. It started with a small group, but soon people from other parts of the world joined. First came the Asians. Later came people from Africa, and the first one was a Maasai from Tanzania, Lazaro Pakipuni, who came there. And the next year, the first person, Vladimir Sangi, came from Russia, representing the very newborn organization of indigenous peoples in the Soviet Union. It is human rights violations that make people from the far corners of the world take the long journey to Geneva or in New York. Geneva is where the human rights institutions are located, and meetings take place there. And since 2002, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is located in New York, where the headquarters is. For indigenous peoples, their first encounter with the United Nations was these human rights mechanisms, and it was within this framework that a particular indigenous space emerged. At home, all indigenous peoples have tried legal and political means to ensure that they were treated as equal citizens, but in vain, and they had to appeal to the international community. The international legal system gives some protection to indigenous peoples' collective rights, but the story of indigenous peoples in the UN is, above all, the story of how groups of marginalized peoples from a plethora of global cultures have been able to confirm these rights and develop new instruments and a common understanding for the legal and international protection. Without any comparison, indigenous peoples have been able to create a unique space for themselves within the United Nations, an alternative indigenous space. And in many respects, I think that this space created within the United Nations somehow is the heart of the global indigenous peoples movement. Scott mentioned, well, it's spreading out and becoming very different, but since specifically in the beginning, it was the heart which was at the international meetings. I use the concept indigenous space as nurtured within the confines of the UN system. But nevertheless, it has its own existence as relatively independent of states and of indigenous communities at home. It is this in-between space, rather than an oppositional structure or a structure set aside, that makes up the indigenous people space in the United Nations. They have been able to create structures and procedures that at the same time break both with their own cultural tradition and with those of states in a process creating this very unique space. This dislocation for local and bounded communities has given indigenous peoples new opportunities. While the indigenous space is a non-bounded community nurtured by the UN system, it is still rooted in a vast number of indigenous communities. One of the most fascinating aspects of the indigenous presence in the United Nations has been that of observing how solutions were found to the most contentious cultural and political issues, when traditional oppositions were set aside and new alliances created. In my analysis, this was possible because indigenous peoples and government could use the use of the United Nations as a relatively autonomous space. It was Aboriginal people from the American and Pacific settler countries that were first to seek the attention of the United Nations. And as such, the indigenous UN agenda long reflected their situation and demands made by them. They opened the gate for people from other parts of the world, people who, at least in the first instance, seems to have more to gain from the United Nations. The newcomers were welcomed and supported by the old-timers, sometimes maybe reluctantly, but due to the enormous differences on the ground. For example, between the North American Indians and the, what I would call destitute hunters and gatherers of Africa. The newcomers may have blurred the process as viewed by the old-timers, but on the other hand, it was a fact that people came from Africa, Asia, the Soviet Union, that suddenly made the indigenous movement a global indigenous movement, where in the early years that has been very much indigenous peoples from the rich Euro-American countries, suddenly it became a global movement. The implications of the annual indigenous presence in the United Nations and of the establishment of the indigenous space are twofold. First, there is a process by which indigenous peoples were able to have an impact upon rules and procedures. And second, there is a configuration of global indigenous identity. To gain access to the United Nations, indigenous peoples had to abide to rules and procedures that but the amazing fact is that indigenous peoples continuously challenge these, and over the years they managed to get these changed significantly. All indigenous peoples present were allowed to address the meeting and give their reports, which is not usual in the United Nations. Indigenous organizations without official non-governmental status were allowed in. Indigenous peoples insisted on starting the meetings with a prayer or invocation, which otherwise is completely illegal in the United Nations. And in the end, they also managed to have a rearrangement of the sittings in the room. You have to imagine, in the early years, you have the government sitting there in front, and there were maybe only 20 government representatives on 100 seats, and then besides you have 300 indigenous peoples filling completely. But that ended up so that today you have, in principle, governments there and indigenous peoples there. In my interpretation, this was only possible because indigenous peoples did not seriously challenge the overall structural framework of the United Nations, whereby the states hold superior power. Indigenous peoples only wanted to be recognized as equal participants, although different, as in accordance with international law. So the forms have changed, but connected to this is the substance from which the creation of common identity among people with so different cultural backgrounds developed. 30 or more years of indigenous presence in the United Nations has refuted the question posed by anthropologist Kiyoteru Spivak, can the subaltern speak, which she herself in her famous article asked negatively. However, in the United Nations, indigenous peoples have shown how subaltern can create their own agenda, take agency, and speak on terms and conditions that have their own logic and formed by them. And I think that is something of the very positive experience Scott told about earlier. Now the question is then, how indigenous peoples did overcome the cultural differences, how indigenous peoples have been able to crack the codes that are specific to one group of other peoples and adopt these codes as symbols that make meaning to everyone, although often interpreted differently. First of all, I will speak about something called the Indigenous Caucus. Within the United Nations, by far the most important innovation was the creation of a new institution called the Indigenous Caucus. Although informal, with no written rules, the Indigenous Caucus is where a consensus that everyone abides by is reached. Every day after or in between the official UN meetings, indigenous peoples meet to discuss issues, strategies, and so on. The caucus rests on consensus, which again is based upon open access, equality, and the acceptance of differences. The Indigenous Caucus is an informal body in which the participants change from day to day, although usually with a small core of people with long UN experience. In principle, the caucus members are all indigenous peoples present at the UN meeting, but you can see there are maybe 300 or 400 or 500, 600 indigenous peoples there, and maybe only 30 or 50 or 70 takes place in each in a caucus meeting. Although the Indigenous Caucus is not an elected body or appointed body, and thus does not strictly represent all indigenous participants, it has been very efficient in setting the indigenous stage, and both indigenous peoples generally and governments consider the caucus as representing the indigenous group. The indigenous group is the epitome of the indigenous space at the United Nations. The structure, or maybe more correct, the idea of the Indigenous Caucus is copied and used in most other international indigenous meetings. The Indigenous Caucus is by and large open to those who want to participate. I'm an anthropologist. I have participated in an endless number of Indigenous Caucus meetings, and if I recall maybe over 25 years, only one, maybe two cases where indigenous peoples wanted everyone who was not indigenous there to leave the room. But if I had not left the room, nobody would have said anything. But I was supposed to leave, and of course I left. But you could see in such a case in the room, there were maybe people who you think he or she is not really indigenous. But it was not questioned. But I come back to that kind of issues. There are no guards at the entrance of the meeting room, no membership form to be filled out. No one is a priori excluded. Membership is not discussed as such, but still silently negotiated, and in this way indigenousness is under continuous construction and reconstruction. Everyone be allowed to speak in the official meetings, as well as in the Indigenous Caucus. Everyone is listened to. And in this silent process emanates a common understanding about who belongs and who does not belong. This is cross-cultural communication leading to cultural understanding. Only by careful observation and from listening to an enormous amount of statements matures the common understanding of indigenous peoples that had created the global indigenousness, which is so powerful that consensus could be reached and which culminated with the adoption of the Declaration in 2007. Some people come to the United Nations only to realize through this silent process that they themselves did not belong there. They were not being thrown out. I could mention the Tamils from Sri Lanka, the Kurds, and the Palestinians. They have all been there. They have seen how it worked. They have not been thrown out. They have gone into a dialogue, but they have withdrawn themselves. Others exclude themselves, and I give an example, that is the Celts. I recall once when the Celts were represented by a group calling themselves the Delegation of Celtic Women. And it was a meeting in what is called the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we were coming close to the end of the meeting, and we were dealing with the item where recommendations should be sent to the Human Rights Council. And one of the Celtic women started. The chair was a person called José Carlos Morales. He's an indigenous from Costa Rica, and he then gives the floor to this Celtic woman. And she starts, "I, the feverish planet, don't wish to end my days as dust under the watch of my guests. Human reptiles passing over my soul, you have bled dry almost all of my natural resources without watching your waste. You are choking me," and then poof, she is cut off by the chair. She's interrupted, she's not sticking to the agenda, but she continues in the same way. And in the end, she's cut off. And he gives the floor to the next speaker. The chair has to give the floor to all speakers equally, indigenous as non-indigenous. But in this case, he uses the right to interrupt those who do not stick to the item on the agenda, but he does it in a selective manner. Many participants in this meeting did not adhere to the agenda, and they were often cut off. During this meeting, however, several indigenous peoples from the Americas talked in similar terms about the right of Mother Earth. And if they were interrupted by the chair, the indigenous audience started shouting and protesting that he was interrupted. But in the case of this Celtic woman, there was not anyone who lifted an eyebrow because she was not simply considered indigenous. And the audience does not consider that she has any indigenous legitimacy. It should be part of the story that 1 year later, I met again this chairperson, José Carlos Morales, and at that time I had thought about this case and other cases, and so I presented him with my academic interpretation. And he looked at me and he said, "Never thought about it that way, but maybe you have a point," he said. There are others who marginalize themselves. They continue to participate in the official meetings, but they never attend the Indigenous caucus, and they make no impact on the negotiations. One of the famous cases is the Black Afrikaners of South Africa and the Rehoboth Bastards of Namibia. There are also those, like the Dalits of India, who use any international forum that they can think of. And finally, there are those who try the indigenous slot, to use the anthropologist Tanya Lee's concept, simply because they don't have any alternative. Caucus meetings may often look chaotic, and they are chaotic. Everyone is allowed to speak. And even if a person completely disregards the agenda or time constraints, he or she is treated with the same respect that is shown to all other speakers. I interpret the open negotiations as trust or willingness to show respect to other people and to honor the integrity of everyone. And to me, as a West European, I mean, it can make me completely crazy to listen to a person who goes on for end and end and end and end. But the indigenous chairs, they accept it, and they very rarely cut a person off. He or she is allowed to speak to the end. The unity of the Indigenous caucus was often severely challenged during the long process of drafting the declaration. In these situations, it was extremely important that the Indigenous caucus remained united and undivided, and that the participants agreed that the attack on one indigenous region would be an attack on everyone, as expressed by the anthropologist Andrew Gray in the mid-1990s. And this is an important point, because it can be taken as an indicator that the construction of a global indigenous identity at that time in the mid-90s was in the making. The ability to overcome differences and the will to work for the common good in order to create consensus and unity only leads to success in the United Nations if internal inclinations to exert power are subdued for the common good. The often outspoken opposition to anyone who tries to act in a way that could be interpreted as monopolizing power is frowned upon by others, and this has similarities with Pierre Cluster's notion from societies where the chief who tries to act as a chief is abandoned. The most distinguished and respected chair of the Indigenous Caucus is the one who is able to reconcile differences, nullify the interest of his or her own group, and who has the knowledge and oratorical skill to speak both to the caucus and to government. Like the caucus itself, consensus is a loosely defined zone of convergence rather than something carved out in stone and written down. The result is that even when everyone agrees that consensus has been reached, there are several interpretations of it. The ability of Indigenous peoples to reach a consensus on matters of key concern to them is probably the greatest achievement in any subaltern actor that has approached the United Nations. In the Indigenous Caucus, consensus is first of all a method of negotiations. Apart from very few cases, voting never takes place in the caucus. And because the caucus is not an official decision-making body where the outcome of voting is noted in official document, consensus as a matter of decision-making is not relevant to this forum. Concerning the strategies adopted by the Indigenous peoples in United Nations, these are in a way very well known, but I will mention some of the strategies. The first of all, that was adopted was being different. In the policies of states and in the view of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures represent the other. To cope with this, Indigenous peoples highlight and are often proud of being different, and the notion of being different creates commonness. The essentialist language of states, the oppressors, has been turned upside down in the hands of Indigenous peoples, who reconstitute the essentials to become symbols of Indigenous identity and of the Indigenous movement. The Indigenous group present in the United Nations share a holistic discrimination with other peoples who may have different livelihoods, but who face the same type of discrimination from the same type of states, the same type of colonialism. It is a process from sharing the same discrimination that brings about the shared concern, then to shared interest, and finally to a shared common identity. From the viewpoint of states, those in power, Indigenous peoples are different and treated as such. And the commonness of the global Indigenous movement is partly constituted through the dynamic process of acceptance, resistance, and opposition. It was specifically in the first years of Indigenous presence of the United Nations that they played the card of being different, of being the other, but at the same time outside the control of government. And they played the exotic card to the utmost. They showed up in exotic clothing, as you saw in the picture a few minutes ago, with a lot of regalia, and it set them completely aside from any other participants in UN meetings. This strategy has its own dynamic. And what the Indigenous peoples did was to do two things at the same time. First, they created an identity of resistance and difference which excluded the oppressors. But second, and no less important, they established and reconstructed an identity for the inclusion and empowerment of Indigenous groups in the same position. Besides being the other, Indigenous people soon adopted a strategy of shaming and embarrassment. They were the victims. It was David against Goliath. It was the evil capitalist against people who have lived in peace and harmony with nature since time immemorial. Again and again, Indigenous people set themselves aside and created unity behind a number of symbols, such as the role of elders, self-determination, sovereignty, the rights of mothers, spirituality, and so on. As the years passed, indigenous peoples were recognized as a group with their own inherent rights. And this changed their strategies because governments could no longer completely ignore them being a political reality. Indigenous peoples were no longer only the victims, they were also agents. Or, as expressed by an indigenous representative from Asia, when we came first we were on the menu card and now we are sitting at the table. In this situation, the most radical means adopted by indigenous peoples is a walkout. The walkout has been used a couple of times, only once with very great success. You imagine a room with 400 participants, 50 government representatives in front and 350 indigenous peoples behind, and then suddenly the 350 walks out. It doesn't work. I mean, even governments can see that you can't sit there and take decisions on people who walked out. It worked once. It has been a catastrophe in one other case, but that is another matter. I think I'm running short of time. I should mention that besides this being different, one of the other issues used by indigenous peoples many times, that is patience. They have gone, sometimes you think, well, the negotiations on the declarations took 25 years. But in these 25 years, indigenous peoples, I mean, they got the time to become a unity among themselves, and they got the time, as they used to say, to educate governments, to teach them about indigenous cultures, to getting them on their side, so that even today the government, they look forward to have an invocation at the beginning and the end of the meeting. And so it's and the indigenous peoples, they have become, I would say, they have been skilled negotiators. And some of the indigenous peoples, specifically from the Arctic regions, from the Inuit in Nunavut, they used 20 years to negotiate a land claims agreement. The Greenlanders used 8 years to have a home rule arrangement. The Sami in Norway, they had 10 years before they got a Sami parliament and so on. And they used these skills of being diplomats in a very good way. Then I would have liked to say something, but I think time is running out. It is that different indigenous peoples have different impacts on the process. I would talk about mandates. Instead of talking about legitimacy, I think we should talk about what mandate do each indigenous person come to the United Nations with. And it is possible to carve out different types of mandates and see how these different mandates make different impacts on the negotiations. It is also so that there are somehow alliances in the United Nations. It is not something that is fixed. One person can be in one alliance one year and the next day in another alliance. Alliance, you could say, I use it with internationals, grassroots, there are the modernists, and so on. And that takes me maybe too long, because I want just to conclude my presentation. Because there are two challenges that are based on my analysis that will have an impact on how the fate of indigenousness or the global indigenousness will look in the future. The first challenge is the capacity of indigenous groups and communities to incorporate the achievements made in the United Nations on the ground. In a global perspective, the fate of indigenous peoples has not improved as a result of the achievements of the UN. On the contrary. If we keep in mind what I have said about the various groups and their mandates in the UN shortly, I will point at 4 factors that are specifically important for indigenous peoples to incorporate the UN, in order to incorporate the UN achievements at home. 1, it's a negotiating capacity. They should have learned to negotiate. 2 is a rootedness in communities. Do they have roots in the communities? 3, goal orientation. Do they have clear goals? And the fourth thing is the ability to make international legal provisions relevant in local and national contexts. This is when indigenous people start coming to the UN. There were quite a number of non-indigenous lawyers who's made a great effort to, you could say, teach indigenous peoples about these very different legal concepts. And these have been taken over, and today we have a lot of knowledgeable indigenous peoples with legal knowledge. The second challenge, and I'm unfortunately Daly Sambo has not arrived yet, because then she would definitely have thrown her hands up immediately. The second challenge to the global indigenous movements, what was made clear during the recent World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in New York. The challenge or danger is that the Indigenous caucus disintegrates before the establishment of a new body that can keep the unity of indigenous peoples from all parts of the globe. In the final phase of negotiating the declaration, indigenous peoples established a global coordinating committee appointed by regional indigenous caucuses to make the final negotiations with governments in New York. I would say that this process was an unquestionable success, and I had the opportunity to follow it on very close hands. The global coordinating group was responsible to the regional caucuses, and the outcome of the negotiations was approved by the regions through internet voting. And it was just, they only got 2 or 3 days when the Mexican, Peruvian, and Ecuadorian governments that said, you have 3 days to get the acceptance, and they got it, acceptance. It came in with dozens and dozens of emails supporting the outcome. A somehow similar structure was created for the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples this year, but without the connections between the coordinating group and the regional caucuses. And to the best of my memory, indigenous peoples had for the first time no common strategy in the workshop of the conference that should make up the action plan for the implementation of the declaration. Instead, the indigenous input to the final outcome document seems to have focused on the creation of new positions and focal points within the United Nations systems. Everyone agreed that implementation of the declaration is the most pressing issue for indigenous peoples globally. But my observation was that indigenous peoples left the World Conference without any strategy on how this should be done. And this was what I hoped that Daly Sambo would comment upon. Thank you.
I was quite pleased to hear the oral version of Professor Dahl's presentation, because I learned in the oral presentation that there was really no difference in the way we were looking at things. There's a piece missing, which was a typology of participants in the Indigenous caucus, in which the typology included a category called Southerner, by which he meant somebody from the Southern Hemisphere who was interested in seeing how international agreements get implemented on the ground. And I'm afraid I'm going to be speaking as a Southerner, which I didn't realize until I read the paper today. And I work in Andean Peru, primarily in the highlands and primarily with speakers of Quechua, but increasingly in the context of Peruvian politics and Peruvian anthropology. I've been sort of pulled into discussions of indigenous rights and indigenous struggles in Peru. And what I want to do is I want to speak to the general issues from my own perspective, which is a perspective of about 30 years working in southern Peru now. And I want to just begin by picking up a few points that Professor Dahl made. First, the critical importance of the organization of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, particularly the declaration of the rights of indigenous peoples, because on the ground it changes the possibilities. It changes the possibilities because it produces rhetorical fulcrums that can be used by local organizations to make specific claims on their governments. I want to pick up a few points that Professor Dahl made in that context, and the importance of the existence of the Permanent Forum and the Indigenous Caucus. Its existence as a forum, it's a cephalous organization, which I thought was quite quite interestingly characterized. The contradiction between the Indigenous Caucus as a non-state actor and the Organization of the United Nations as an organization of states, and that I think is a huge novelty that I hope we get to talk about further in this, and the question of representativity. And I want to take up from those who gets to speak for whom. And I do think the question of representativity is critical, and it plays out on the ground in multiple ways. I want to talk about two of those, and here I turn into a Southerner, and instead of looking at things from top down, I look at things from bottom up. On the issues of representativity, if I were to compare indigenous organizations in the 5 or so Andean republics, in the republics in Western South America, there are two in particular that I want to talk about, and those are the indigenous movements in Ecuador and Bolivia. And the reason they're interesting is because they're built up out of base organizations. And this is obviously a calc translation from Spanish, but I don't have another way of putting it that's more clear in English. So I'm going to leave you with base organization as a learned barbarism. And a base organization is an organization in which, by virtue of living in a particular community or particular settlement, one has rights to membership and representation in an organization that speaks for and by and to indigenous people. And there are two such organizations that are worth talking about. There are similar organizations in Colombia to these two, but in Ecuador there's an organization called CONAI, which is a coordinating council of Amazonian and highland indigenous people, and in Bolivia, CONAMAC, and both of these have, by the way, been active in the Permanent Forum. Particularly CONAMAC has been active in the Permanent Forum, and CONAMAC similarly is organized out of communities that elect representatives to regional councils. The regional councils choose a national coordinating council. CONAMAC is primarily a highland organization that now coordinates with Amazonian people in Bolivia. What's interesting about them is both are now in opposition to governments that they helped to bring into power in both of those cases. And in the case of CONAMAC, over the last month, 6 weeks, there's been a concerted effort by the Bolivian government, the newly re-elected president, Evo Morales, to split CONAMAC because it's been so fervently in opposition to the Bolivian government. In Peru, there was similarly a base organization called the Peruvian Peasant Confederation, because in Peru, by fiat of the government in the 70s, there are no indigenous people, there are peasants instead. And this becomes an issue later on. And that organization was destroyed during the internal war of the 1990s. But there is a tendency that you pick up in the Andean republics, and I'll add Colombia to that list because there's similar organizations in Colombia, to organize by base organizations. And so the question of representativity doesn't come up at the local level, but it now does come up at the national level in Bolivia, and it comes up in the international level because at an international level for peoples without base organizations, the real questions as to who gets to speak on Indigenous issues, who gets to speak to Indigenous issues in international fora. If I turn totally southern now, and I simply look at Peru, the country I know best, there's an interesting, depressing, actually, pattern that I want to talk about, and I want to give you a capsule history of the country that'll be unlike any history of the country that you've heard before, because I won't talk about formal politics, but I'll talk about some very large movements since World War II, and I take World War II as the starting point because I want to talk about these themes in a time period that coincides with the emergence of the United Nations as an organization. And so until 1969, Native peoples were incorporated into an estate system in Peru, sometimes called the hacienda system, in which there was forced labor. They were bounded to estates. My general tendency in these things is simply to refer to it by the English word that best characterizes it, which is slavery. And in the point of emancipation, which was 1969, the indigenous communities that were formed out of the former estates were required to pay for the estates that were expropriated by the government and went into massive debt in order to do that, some of which required them to sell the land base off. In the 1990s, there was a very well-known internal war for which there were 70,000 deaths, the majority of which were indigenous peoples they were massacred by both major combatants, and there was also forced resettlement of indigenous people. And there was, in the lowlands, at least in the Amazon, slavery that was carried out by the insurgent group called Shining Path. In the 1990s, at the same time, the government, the de facto government at the time, sterilized 30,000 women forcibly, in many cases at gunpoint, primarily indigenous women, and that's a substantial portion of the reproductive population of the country. In the 2000s, with the return to democracy, mineral rights were sold out from under communities. 70% of the country is divided into lots that have been leased to mining corporations, and I'm even excluding the petroleum corporations, which are not included in that statistic. So it comes up to between 90 and 95% of the land base of the country has been turned into lots in which the corporations have mineral rights regardless of who is living there. So what about World Trade Organization Agreement 169, which gives indigenous communities the right to initial consultation, to prior consultation on mining their lands? It's been ratified by Peru, but for different reasons, some technical, some openly political, it's not been implemented. In 2009, one of the communities, an Amazonian community of Awahun speakers, protested against the lottification, I don't know quite what to call it, of their lands in a place called Bagua, and they were met by military and police. There was a massacre there. It included the death of about 25 police and military, and the response of the government has been to try the leadership of the community as a form of collective punishment of the people of Bagua. In the 2010s, in the positive side, there's been increasing discussion of racism. On the negative side, it's been accompanied by increasingly overt racism, including open calls for genocide. And in 2014, one of the discussions of racism led to a television program called Paisana Jacinta, in which a transvestite coastal person played an indigenous woman in a burlesque kind of way, and that led to protests, at least among the elites in Peru. Here's what international pressure has focused on of all of these issues. It's focused on the TV show. Here's what foreign social scientists and Peruvian social scientists as well have looked at. They've done minimal work on some of these issues, but important work on these. I'm proud to say that the majority of the work on these different issues has been carried out by Michigan PhDs. So I'm unhappy about that. I'm unhappy at the limitation of the research that's been carried out. So some takeaways. So the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Indigenous Caucus are absolutely critical to constructing frameworks for reshaping indigenous issues at the state level. But we should not imagine for a minute that we do not have a long road ahead in implementing on the ground the gains made in the international fora. And that's the point where I think I agree with Professor Dahl. So my big takeaway is, with respect to the Permanent Forum, don't celebrate, organize.
All right. Good morning, and I want to start by thanking the organizers, Scott and Kelly, for including me in this panel and allowing me the opportunity to comment on Professor Dahl's research. I already was a big fan of this book, so I jumped at the opportunity to comment on his presentation. And just quickly, my background on indigenous politics: I've studied indigenous people in Japan, in northern parts of Japan, called Ainu. And this is a group that was politically completely dormant up until the 70s. And their movement was really constituted by the exposure to international indigenous movements. And subsequently, they started going to the UN using their working groups and the Permanent Forum to advance their movement and made some significant strides, having been just in 2008 recognized as an indigenous people by the Japanese government. And I've written about this history somewhere else, so I'm not going to go into details, but just to say that I was involved, I was helping the Ainu in terms of translation when they come to the UN Permanent Forum, and I participated in the Permanent Forum almost every year up until a couple of years ago. So I mean, this book has a lot of photos of the UN forums, including Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and I can try to see if I'm in one of those pictures, but I couldn't find myself. In any case, so this is my background, and I have some Ainu nerd type of questions that I can probably ask Professor Dahl later. My Ainu friends claim that they were the first to bring a laptop to a UN forum, or they were the first to wear indigenous costumes throughout the Permanent Forum working group session. I want to hear your thoughts, reactions on that later. But here I want to focus on his presentation and the book. And his research, the way I see his research, he has been tackling three questions, and the presentation here focused on the third question. Okay, the three questions are the first: why indigenous peoples became politically active all over the world since the late 60s, especially since the 70s. And that's not to say they were completely inactive anywhere in the world. There were some activities, but seemingly from the outside world, really there's been an explosion of indigenous rights activism, really all over the world. And why is it? The second question he asks is, and why did they go to the UN? Why did they go to the international community? Why did they find the UN so useful? And the third question is, why did they, indigenous peoples, why did they succeed in carving out their own space, the indigenous space in the UN system? And as you heard, his presentation today focused on the third question, so I'm going to focus on the third. But quickly, I want to give you an overview, his answers, or sort of scholarship on the first two questions. So why did indigenous peoples became politically active since the 60s? People like Ron Nietzsche talk about, he outlined four factors, I think, and failed assimilation policies that exposed the problems with that policy, and at the same time, inadvertently, from the point of view of the government, created solidarity, political unity, and cultural identity, as well as organizational capacity among indigenous peoples. And that helped them launch some political activism. And Professor Dahl adds to this argument a more of a political economy, global angle, talking about this, what he calls a new phase of global capitalism. Since the 60s, 70s, a lot of multinational corporations went around the world trying to find places to extract more resources. And in this new phase, governments were complicit with multinationals and started going to really every corner of the world, literally trying to extract more resources. And in their effort, they were afraid of, and in those areas, typically, what we today call indigenous peoples lived in those areas. So there were obstacles from the point of view of the governments and multinationals. So they tried to deal with, quote unquote, indigenous peoples, and in many cases started repressing them more harshly. And indigenous peoples started rising up in opposition to that increasing levels of repression. And Nietzsche also talks about the rise of indigenous middle class. There's somewhat more resource capacity for a lot of indigenous peoples, especially in North America and Europe, to engage in collective political mobilization. There's also this normative change in the global politics generally, the rise of human rights concerns, sort of growing acceptance of the right to self-determination. Nietzsche also points to the struggle against fascism and decolonization as the precursors to that growing norm about rights. It shouldn't be neglected. The impact of the civil rights movement in the U.S. in the 60s also had this, in the sense of this broader rights, minority rights activism that had an impact on the process. Okay. So these are some of the factors that explain the rise of indigenous politics, indigenous activism since the late 60s, 70s. Okay. And the second question, why did they go to the UN? Just simply put, because domestic politics really didn't produce any remedies for indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples typically were the most marginalized groups, so the government had an easy time repressing them with impunity, and that was the end of the story. But now, as if you've read Kekan Seking's activists Beyond Borders, this is really a typical case of the boomerang, what they call the boomerang pattern. Okay? The domestic recourse is not available, so they would go around and go to the international forum to pressure the government to make some changes, and that a lot of indigenous peoples took that course of action. And leader groups started coming, as Professor Dahl outlined, from developed nations like US, Canada, some European, Nordic countries, and they opened the door for other indigenous peoples to come, and they joined later. Okay. And this process is quite interesting. This is, I don't know how conscious they were, but it seems to me that a lot of early comers to the UN, indigenous peoples, they realized the importance of this cumulative effect of more indigenous peoples coming in and exerting more pressure on the UN key actors and the governments. And it's also interesting because the payoff wasn't entirely clear in early stages, but somehow a lot of people started coming and developed solidarity, camaraderie with each other, as Professor Dahl outlined. So that leads to the third question of why did indigenous peoples succeed in gaining access in the UN, creating their sort of global indigenous identity. Okay? And here, Professor Dahl, I'm not going to repeat what he said, but there are some key factors like the importance of the Indigenous caucus, where intergroup solidarity developed, and international networks of indigenous activists developed. And the Indigenous caucus, as he alluded to, played a major role in this process, and the informal democratic style of deliberation and consensus-based decision-making process really helped in that process. And also another important factor he mentions is the indigenous peoples did not seriously challenge the overall structural framework of the United Nations that was dominated by the states. Okay? So on these points, I want to pose a question quickly. On the first point about the international networks, so it is true that, and he makes a point about how those indigenous individuals, activists, who are detached from the state space of the states, as well as from the local communities that they are from, have this capacity, because of their freedom, to push the indigenous movement forward in the global, in the international forums. And I agree with his assessment, and in pushing for something like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I think this was an important point, important factor. But I wonder, as we move from establishing international norms about indigenous rights to, as he says, bringing those ideas back home and implement changes that the Declaration calls for. In that process, I wonder if this detachment from local communities might actually be a problem. As I circle around UN forums for indigenous peoples, some indigenous activists pointed to some individuals, and they never go back to their communities. And some of them can't go back because the government doesn't allow them, but I'm not talking about these people. Some activists who live in Geneva and New York, basically, and really don't have a lot of connection. They really don't know what's going on in their local communities. They make a living out of being an indigenous activist in international forums. Are they capable? They probably helped in developing the norm and establishing, drafting the draft Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Do they help in bringing those fruits back to local communities, or do they have that capacity to do that? That's the first question. The second question is this process of this informal democratic style and consensus-based decision-making process. I wish we could have that for our faculty meetings, but it sounds fantastic and it might be somewhat time-consuming, but it seems to work well. But I wonder, and also this relates to this identification of who is a legitimate international people and who is not. I witnessed some tension. For instance, I work with Ainu, and there's another group in Japan called Okinawans. And there is a little bit, I don't want to overblow this, but there's a little bit of tension, because Ainu were the first comers to the UN, and they are absolutely legitimate indigenous people. And I think Okinawans have legitimate claim too, but from the point of Ainu people, Okinawans seem like they are a majority in their communities, and they freely express, almost freely, largely express their culture and practice their culture, whereas Ainu, a marginalized group even within their communities, and their cultural rights have been suppressed. So from the point of view of Ainu, they don't really see Okinawans as legitimate as themselves, as an indigenous people. And they don't necessarily block Okinawans' participation in the UN, but when there's limited resource, for instance, to come to the Asian caucus or to the UN Permanent Forum, they make that argument that we deserve that more than, I hope this is off the record, more than the Okinawans. So there might be this tension where early comers who are already part of this relatively powerful mechanism in the UN might use this consensus-based decision-making in terms of who belongs and who doesn't to their advantage and exclude latecomers, making an argument that they don't belong. So I wonder if there's a danger in this process. And I'm running out of time, so quickly, this argument about how indigenous peoples became powerful because they didn't challenge the state power in the UN, I agree with that, and I wonder, even so, the government, I wonder why they really enabled indigenous peoples really, right, carve out their space in the UN forums, because they are a threat, right? I mean, they could claim their territories, they meaning indigenous peoples, and nonetheless, the governments seem to allow them to, enable them to take hold in the UN forums. And was it because they seemed so small and powerless in the 70s and 80s? Or was it because their moral force was so strong that the governments couldn't really argue against indigenous people's claims? Or did indigenous peoples make a sort of an effort to cleverly get in there, have an entry, and then expanded their claims over time? I wonder if you could speak to this process of what enabled them to convince the governments that they can take that space in the UN. Thank you.
So Jens, go ahead and maybe respond to that. We'll go another 6 minutes.
6 minutes, okay.
Yes, we will allow 6 minutes for audience questions.
I try to answer some of the questions. The discussion on representativity, that's what I try. I try not to talk too much about representativity, but talk about the mandate. The person who is coming from a very small community may be as representative as the one coming from a huge umbrella NGO. And one, in my opinion, critical thing and an error that indigenous peoples do in the UNI nations say, okay, I am this and that, and I'm representing my Innu people or something. And you all know that this person only comes from a small community and has never been appointed. So in a way, indigenous people sometimes use a language which indicates a kind of representativity which is not true. On the other hand, if it comes to who contribute to the UN process, the person who represents a very, very small community may add as much to the negotiating efforts as one who is representing 100,000 Indians from the highland in Peru. So in that sense, I definitely prefer to talk about the mandate. By the way, the same question we could ask about, come on, what about the Syrian Minister of Foreign Affairs? Who is he representing anyone in Syria? What about the Chinese delegate? Is he really representative for the Chinese people? So it's not an issue only for indigenous people, it's an issue every time you had this kind of discussion. This was one thing. Another thing, which is maybe you know more about that in Latin America and than I do, but that is that sometimes those people who represent local communities, they would never be accepted when they try to run for a position in an national umbrella. It's two different kind of processes, different kind of peoples. So therefore, again, we should not be too critical to a person who only represents a small community of 1,000 people and saying that, well, the person who represents the umbrella NGO is more representative than the one at the local level. No, it's a different kind of mandate. It's a different kind of representativity. And each of these two persons contribute in a different way to the negotiations. So that was... you mentioned this thing about assimilation and eviction from the territories, enslavement, which has been done in the lowland of Peru, and these kind. This is important to remember. Then that people say, but you're no longer living on the land that you claim to have relationship to. No, it's true, because we have been evicted from it. Do we lose all our rights when we have been evicted from that land? I mean, then it's very easy, just throw people out and then you lose all your rights. and these it's a critical thing. Then the issue of the laptop, I hadn't realized that, but that the Ainu were the first ones to come. But what really I think was funny to see that who had the first laptops in the UN? That was all the indigenous people's government representative. They had no laptops. And still, even today, you see that very few government representatives have their laptops at the meeting, but all indigenous people say there's one big row of laptops. They are not using it only for meeting purposes, but that's another thing.
Facebook.
Then your question about I would call them the New Yorkers, those indigenous peoples who are, you could say, jet set indigenous peoples. There are not that many of them. They are there. And as a matter of fact, the other indigenous peoples know them. I think maybe in the book, I don't recall, there was an indigenous caucus meeting. And just at the end of it, there was someone, we all know him, an Ecuadorian living in New York. Being more indigenous than anyone else. And he started up and coming up with very radical solutions. And people listened to him, and but then said, thank you, and so they went on to the next point. But on the other hand, there are also those indigenous peoples with no roots to the communities who have made great impacts on the legal negotiations. But you're right, there are people who don't come back to the communities. When I'm saying detached from the communities means that they have a mandate which make them able to negotiate without always coming back to the community. People whom are very grassroots related. They may add very much to the documentation issue. But if they have every time there is a negotiation going on, they have to go back and refer back to the community. That they are not very, you could say, they don't make great impact on those. They make impact on other issues. That is. Then you have the question about the Okinawans. I have sometimes feel the same tensions. There are tensions. Of course there are tensions, and of course there are distrust and mistrust among indigenous peoples. But there's also this that maybe there is a person who the majority of the Sami of Norway do not recognize that person as really Sami. But the other people in the indigenous caucus from Asia, they have no problem with that person. And one group who has come up in world politics is the Crimean Tatars. And the Crimean Tatars have come to the UN many times. And the other indigenous peoples from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, they don't see the Crimean Tatars indigenous. But the other from Africa and Asia, they have no problems with seeing him as an indigenous. So, and then you see the Ukrainian government has never recognized the Crimean Tatars as indigenous before now that Russia has annexed the Crimean Peninsula. And then suddenly the Ukrainian government are talking about their indigenous people. There's a lot of course, of politics, and that makes an impact on trust and distrust. Furthermore, in that respect, we should remember that there are people who never dream of coming to the UN meetings, specifically those who have very close relationships with the governments. If you say, but what about the indigenous people from Canada who come there? Those who come there are not those who are recognized by the Canadian governments. Very many of them are very traditional indigenous groups. So they don't represent all the indigenous peoples of Canada, but they represent specific communities and specific groups. And that is, that's fine to me. And we just have to recognize that's how it is. And then, of course, the last question that you came with, why do government allow indigenous peoples in? Allow indigenous peoples in and create this space within the United States? I can't answer that in one word. One is, of course, that, as I mentioned, it is a shaming. Oh, you government, you treat these people very badly. So it was a kind of, they allowed them in. But I think most government had never imagined that they were so aggressive. in the UN. And it was a gradual process going on, and going on. You don't even allow us to speak at the meeting. Well, how can you talk about indigenous rights if you don't allow us to speak? So then there were indigenous peoples created alliances with some friendly governments. And this should not be underestimated, that there are governments who want to be friends of indigenous peoples. Canada, just to mention one, but a couple of governments in Latin America, not the least, like to see the indigenous peoples in the UN, support the indigenous peoples. And some of the European countries do the same. The African governments wouldn't dream of doing that, and the Asian governments mainly also. But it's a mixture of a number of things. So, thank you so much.